it looks like we have a lot of slides left, but most of them are sort of, a lot of them are sort of informational. Basically, when we start to think about tempering alloy steels, we have to think about where our carbides are going to form, because different alloying elements are going to segregate either to the ferrite or the austenite differently, right? And so, and what the structure of these alloy carbides are going to be going to look like, because that's going to have a profound effect on the mechanical properties, right? If we have a fine dispersion of alloy carbides, we're going to have basically like an age hardening effect, like you do in aluminum alloys. Whereas if we get coarse, right, we're not going to have that. We're not going to see that secondary strengthening type. Basically, the big thing on this slide is that a lot of these alloy carbides nucleate heterogeneously, right, on dislocations in the martensite structure, and nucleate at grain boundaries and sub-boundaries, right? And basically, we see that these molybdenum carbides, right? There's a couple different allotropes that form, different compounds that form, and we see them originally on the dislocation networks, right? And then they age and they form. I got arrows here, right? So we nucleate a very fine dispersion heterogeneously on dislocations. Then they will coarsen to form these rod-like structures, and then they will actually, that should be metal 6 carbide, right? And then you'll have additional carbides that form at the grain boundaries. So if we look at some specifics, right, and if we look at vanadium and chromium, vanadium is important because it forms these very small platelets, right, they nucleate heterogeneously but are coherent with the matrix, and then they coarsen very, very quickly, right? So the kinetics of these also becomes quite important, right? So we're going to have much more significant strengthening at these early stages than at the later coarsen stage. Chromium's an important one. We get a couple different carbides that form, chromium 7,6 and chromium 23,6, right? And they form from the cementite, right? Because chromium is a stronger carbide former than the iron and the other, and this typically happens at the interface. And if we have high enough chromium concentration, we can get significant secondary hardening during the tempering out of it, right? So the reason this occurs is we get heavy, very fast diffusion, right? So if we have a high enough chromium concentration, right, we get a secondary hardening effect, but then because of the high diffusivities, we get very fast diffusion, very fast coarsening of these particles. So we then get a very fast softening that occurs after, right? Right, and in general, the mechanical properties of tempered alloy steels are higher than plain carbon, right? So here we see carbon concentration, the alloy series. We generally have both higher tensile strength, and this is a toughness or impact strength, and versus tensile strength. So we have a tougher steel that's stronger than carbon, right, at any strength value, right? So all of the commercially available steels in the tempered condition will be both stronger and tougher than plain carbon steels, right? That's the beauty of what alloying gives us for us. And this is just the kinetics here, right? So we make good use of secondary hardening, right? Once the carbide forms, you can heat treat up to temper up to 500, range of 500 to 600, and still keep your high strength values. Once you get above that, we dissolve or either dissolve or grow our carbides to the point where they're not effective, right? Mar-aging steels we're going to talk about when we talk about high advanced high strength steels, so we don't need to worry about those for the exam. There's a little bit more that's going on here, than just that half slide that I wanted to hit. During tempering, there's actually two types of embrittlements that come up that we need to be aware of, either called tempered martensite embrittlement or temper embrittlement. And basically the effect is that if you look at the tempering, the impact strength versus tempering temperature, so this is a measure of toughness, right? We get this sort of oscillating behavior where we have these two wells where we get decreased impact strength during tempering, and it's not all steels, right? So the first one is tempered martensite embrittlement, or TME, sometimes called one-step embrittlement. And basically, right, it's low alloy steels. There's a tempering range that we want to avoid, and basically what we see is that we get a change in the carbide structure from epsilon to cementite, which then forms a film at the grain boundaries, right? If we raise the temperature up, this film disappears, can be dissolved, and then if we go back down into this range, it doesn't come back, right? So this is why it's called one-time or irreversible embrittlement, because once you get rid of it, it doesn't come back, right? And it's all about getting a film of cementite on the grain boundary, right? And so if we have alloying elements such as tin or sufficient nitrogen concentration, this doesn't occur. And silicon, right? If we add significant silicon concentration, it inhibits the formation of cementite in this temperature range, because our silicon is basically dissolved in the epsilon carbide and increases the stability, right? So basically the two ways to avoid it are prevent the epsilon carbide from dissolving, or put in alloying elements that prevent the nucleation at the grain boundaries. So if you have elements like these that segregate to the grain boundaries, you're not going to have cementite forming there. Okay, so the second well is what's called temper embrittlement, right? So, and the range here is this 450 to 600 range, right? And this is sometimes called reversible embrittlement, because it's going to happen anytime that we come back into this range. And it's really important because it has a very profound effect on properties. The notched impact, right? The temperature at which the ductile to brittle transition occurs, right? And intergranular fracture along the original grain boundaries, right? It can be real problems if we get stuck in this range. And generally, carbon steels are fairly immune to it. Alloy steels with high purity don't show it, but if we have impurities that are very low in the presence of alloying elements that we care about, like nickel, manganese, chromium, and silicon, it can occur. And this is really a co-precipitation issue, right? We get co-segregation between these. We have these elements have a strong affinity between them, right? And then we're going to slowly react to form stable carbides that then will segregate to the grain boundaries, right? And so now we've got weakened grain boundaries, right? So notice that the same impurity elements that prevent martensite temper embrittlement, right, are bad for temper embrittlement, right? Basically, if we get significant molybdenum in there and we just avoid this temperature range, it's an easy thing to avoid, right? And exactly what's going on there isn't so important. It's just more important, at least for this, to be aware of the phenomena, right? The mechanism of this co-segregation and then further segregation when you have carbide formation to the grain boundaries, it's pretty complicated, right? There's a lot going on. But in reality, for all practical purposes, knowing that these two effects occur, right, and the general range that you're going to have issues with, that you have to be aware of if you temper in this range, and it's going to be the degree at which this happens is going to be a function of your alloy composition, is really what's important to know, the specific details of how this happens. Okay, so that's sort of bulk heat treatment processes. In steel, there's also a whole lot of surface modifications that happen, and generally we can think of this as surface hardening, right, by thermal processes, or surface hardening by thermochemical processes. The simplest one is just flame hardening, right? This is anyone who's ever done any oxyacetylene welding, right, is very familiar with this, right? Especially if you have a oxyacetylene torch and you make it a slightly rich flame, carburizing flame, right? You can flame harden and carburize simultaneously. But basically, all you're doing here is you're taking a torch, you're heating up the surface, and then rapidly quenching. So you're just hardening the surface of your sample, right? And by doing this, the depth to which it's hardened is called your case depth, right? So that's how thick your hardened layer is on the surface of your material versus your tougher steel, right? And it's just a matter of how deep your your heat went, right? How big of a temperature gradient, right? And flame hardening, I mean, this is the standard, right? Has anyone ever done any blacksmithing, right? You know, if you're making a chisel, right, or even a screwdriver, right, you want the cutting surface of your chisel to be hard, but you want your most of your blade and your tang to be soft, right? So essentially, that's what flame hardening is useful for, right? For spot treatment of hardening. Induction hardening is basically the same thing, where you have local regions that you want harder, right? Where you can use induction heating on a very localized region to heat it up, right? And this is a really convenient way of hardening certain surfaces on crankshafts, pins, right? Anything where you need any rotational part where you need local hardness, right? We can do induction heating and then quench, right? And it's very fast, right? Right, it's really a mass-produced thing. Laser hardening and the next one, electron beam hardening, are sort of specialized. Laser hardening, basically, you just whack it with a laser to get very local heating, but you also get plastic deformation, right? So you also get compressive stresses. So laser hardening is kind of a combination of shot peening and localized hardening from martensite formation all in one, right? Because you get plastic deformation as well. But you get the case depth is very small, right? Is much smaller than induction and flame hardening. Plus, you need a big laser, right? And so you need to really control the energy input. So it's much more of a specialized technique. Electron beam hardening is basically the same thing, except now you're just using a electron beam rather than a laser to get your heating, right? And since it's very localized heating, you need a big volume, right, of material that you're not hardening, right, to keep from melting, right? You need to have enough material to conduct all that big electron density that's coming in away. Otherwise, you're just going to melt a hole right through your sample. But basically, it's the same thing. Just electron beam hits, causes local heating. So that's the gist of surface. There's more note of plain surface treatments. There's more notes there to give a little more detail if you're interested. For thermochemical treatments, right, the big, oops, going the wrong way, right, the ones that you're probably most familiar with are carburizing and nitriding, right? Carburizing, all you're doing is trying to get additional carbon into your material, right? Basically, if we have a low carbon steel, right, and we then put it in a carbon enriched environment, we can diffuse additional carbon into the surface. This also helps correct the fact that oftentimes you have a depleted region of carbon at the surface from treatment because carbon diffuses so rapidly. right? You get carbide mill scale that forms, right? You probably saw this during the geometry tests that you did, right? For the undergrads that are in the metals lab, right? So you get the mill scale that forms. So you got a carbon depleted region at the surface. So basically, carburizing is we just put it in a carbon-enriched environment, and carbon monoxide, usually carbon using the form of carbon monoxide, diffuses in, gives you in iron with enriched carbon and carbon dioxide, right? And so this is very easy to do, again, with an oxyacetylene torch, right? If you just make it a rich flame, so you have extra acetylene going in, the incomplete combustion, you have plenty of carbon monoxide, right? And by heating your steel in that way, you can torch carburize and harden the surface of your steel, right? If we heat this in a carbon dioxide rich environment, this reaction goes backwards, right? And we can decarburize the steel and remove carbon from solution to soften it. Right? And typically then, this is done in the fully hard state, right? So you'll carburize in the martensite and then go through your tempering steps, right? And so this allows you to get a very fine grain size and the maximum case hardness, right? Where did nitriding go? Okay, so cyaniding and carbonitriding are basically two ways we're putting in both carbon and nitrogen at the same time. The idea is basically the same, except in cyaniding, we use a liquid salt bath, and if you do it in gas atmospheres, it's carbonitriding, right? And in cyaniding, we put a salt bath in, and they diffuse, both carbon and nitrogen diffuse into the steel, and this is primarily done, right? You get additional hardness in the steel from the additional interstitial content, but you get a wear-resistant layer from the formation of epsilon phase that contains both carbon and nitrogen, right? Right. So this is done much more for wear resistance than necessarily just hardness at the surface. Carbonitriding is basically the same thing. It's sometimes called dry cyaniding or gas cyaniding, right? But what you're doing is putting, instead of a liquid bath, you're doing it in gaseous, right? And so you get, the main thing is you get hardenability because you've got increased interstitial concentration and wear resistance, and some benefit to corrosion resistance, right? Okay. So these, one point I need to make here. So if you look at the temperatures, right, 750 to 900, this is done in the austenite regime, right? So this is above the austenite temperature for cyaniding and carbonitriding. For regular nitriding, on the other hand, we do this in the ferrite region, so we don't have a phase transformation, right? Basically, you're trying to dissolve nitrogen into the ferrite, right? But the solubility of nitrogen is small, so basically everything becomes rapidly forms high nitride, very hard nitride intermetallics, right? So Fe3N, right? And our other strong nitride formers, aluminum, chromium, molybdenum, right? And we form a very hard wear-resistant nitride particles, right? So basically, right? And then boronizing and chromizing are sort of more recent, not as common methods, but are important for tool steels. Right. So basically, forming a boron will diffuse in and form these boride. Right. These borides, and there's two stoichiometric forms that form iron boride and iron. Oh shoot, my inorganic. So I forget what the valency of these is, right? FeB and Fe2b. I'm a bad chemist.
2 and 3.
Right, it's 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but anyway, we've got two different stoichiometric compounds that can form, right? FeB is brittle and tends to form more towards the surface. Fe2b is tougher and forms more internally. It's important in for tool steels for dies, right? If you're making dies and molds, a boronized surface will greatly improve the mold life by giving you better abrasive and sliding wear resistance, and it reduces the amount of lubrication that's needed to use, right? Chromizing is similar. There's a couple different variants on it. You get good corrosion resistance out of it. It's not a super important process. This is different than chrome coating, right? So this isn't putting that nice shiny layer. Right. Basically, you're trying to you're diffusing additional chrome into the surface, right? Where that chrome will then do all the stuff that chrome does in every other alloy. All right, in the bulk, it just does it more at the surface, mostly forming good intermetallics for you. Okay, so those are the surface treatments. The last thing we want to hit on is thermomechanical processing. Particularly, this is really important for rolled sheet, right? Most of the automotive steels, right, and a lot of structural steels are rolled, right? So both for sheet and for plates and even I-beam construction, right? Those are formed primarily by rolling. And so by controlled rolling, we can get very high strength levels out. And the idea here is we're going to deform in such a way that we keep recrystallizing, right? So we're deforming in our austenite regime. We want to keep recrystallizing our grains to keep them small. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we keep our secondary phase particles that prevent grain growth, right? So the whole idea behind controlled rolling is the formation of fine structures that have a fine prior austenite grain size before transforming, right? And these secondary phase particles are generally carbides of our microalloying elements, niobium, vanadium, and titanium, right? And these are the key elements that are going to be pinning our grain boundary, right? So if we have fine austenite grains, remember that's going to give us a fine ferrite grain structure in our final as use, right? And we have a ton of grain boundary area that our ferrites can grow from, right? Okay. So what we need to also consider, though, is that these same particles that inhibit grain growth also sort of retard our recrystallization rate, right? So we need to think about the kinetics of this, right? And during rolling, we also are pancaking or elongating our grains, right? So that's also giving us significantly more grain boundary area to nucleate our ferrite from, right? So really what we want is a fine ferrite structure. That slide basically just said the same thing here, right? And so this flow chart sort of shows what we talked about before, right? If we recrystallize, we have a fine equiaxed austenite. If we don't recrystallize, we have a fine sort of pancaked structure, right? So basically, the recrystallization, depending on the composition of your carbides, you can get recrystallization that happens several times before we reach the transformation temperature, right? Before we're cool enough, right? And most of the time, what happens is we continue to roll through the our eutectoid temperature, right? We keep deforming as we're cooling, so that we're deforming the ferrite, the austenite grains, and the growing ferrite range. And so we look at our final, where we stop rolling, what our final ferrite grain size is, that if we continue to roll as we cool down to 7 through the eutectoid temperature, we can get a much smaller, a 50% reduction in grain size over if we roll stop rolling above the eutectoid temperature, right? And then we have Hall-Petch effects, right? Right. So our slope, right? Here's our Hall-Petch slope, right? Significantly stronger than what we saw for aluminum. We get additional strengthening, right? This is plain carbon steel with a little bit of manganese. If we have some niobium in it, we form niobium carbide. So we get, that's our strength increase from the fine dispersion of niobium carbide, right? So that's basically controlled rolling, right? The big idea right, is we want to continuously deform, we want to recrystallize repeatedly while at the same time keeping our grain size small. As we cool, we want to continue to deform through our transformation region so that we end up with a final ferrite grain size. Right? And then we have,
And that, you want to keep rolling through the transformation temperature. Is that just so that you have dislocations to nucleate on?
Well, you're going to be nucleating primarily at grain boundaries, at the austenite grain boundaries.
Yeah.
What it is you don't want the right. So if you think about what happens when we grow through at close to the equilibrium temperature, right? We're going to get large perlite colonies potentially that can be larger than the original prior austenite structure, right? Because they can grow and take over, right? Because the driving force for nucleation isn't significantly high, right? Because we're at very low undercooling, right? So that's what you're essentially preventing, right? You keep breaking up the structure, right? By cooling, by deforming as you cool through, right? Make sense?
Yep.
So all of this just comes back to the thermodynamics and kinetics of the different phase transformations that we talked about before, right? So and then a couple other processes, this sort of hot-cold working, right? And so with hot thermomechanical treatment or high temperature thermomechanical treatment or low temperature treatments, basically the hot HTMT, the hot working, we're above the the A3 temperature, so we're above our eutectoid temperature. We deform, right, and then quench our deformed austenite through the martensite region, right? Or our low process would fully become ferritic and then deform, right? So the idea here is we want to deform in such a way, unlike controlled rolling, where we don't recrystallize, right? So our deformed, our pancaked but not recrystallized austenite then forms martensite, right? And so what is this going to do, right? When we deform our austenite, we say we get these long pancake grains, right? So now if we go to martensite, we now have steels that anisotropies carried through to our martensite. So now we have a directional dependence to our martensite formation, right? And because we're nucleating at the grain boundaries, right, we now have a strongly anisotropic martensitic structure in the sheet, and this gives us better ductility, right, and also potentially, depending, improved strength and fatigue strength, right? And it's all about the direction and the same microalloying elements, vanadium, titanium, and niobium, right, that were really important for pitting the grain boundaries before. If we add enough of them, they also slow recrystallization, right? So getting the balance between a steel that does well by controlled rolling versus a steel that that is good under HTMT is really the balance of those microalloying elements. So Taysun hit us.
So if it is depending on the working before what is it, properties also depend on the direction of this node?
Yes. Yes. Right. So this is strong directional properties in your final structure. Right? Yeah. So it's going to depend on your use case, right? Your transverse strength is not going to be as good as your along the length. So we had a question.
This might sound dumb, but so since you're like rolling it out in the transverse and longitudinal directions, you're gonna be the longest in terms of your grain diameter or whatever. In your nucleating martensite from the grain boundaries, aren't you going to get more crystals that are longer in the normal direction than in the transverse or rolling directions?
You'll have shorter lengths, right, along the rolling direction. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it'll be stronger.
Oh.
In that way.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. But right. And then the other case, right, are low LTMT, right, is also called os forming. Right? And then what we're basically doing here is coming down to below the A3 temperature into the region between the perlite bay and the bainite bay, where we're in this right, metastable austenite regime, where we have to hold for a long time before we would get Widmanstatin structures to form. So if we can deform and then quench before we hit the start to transform, and if we can quench fast enough that we just barely clip the nose or miss the nose of the bainite bay, right? We're cooling the austenite to well below the recrystallization temperature, right? Then we can roll and then quench and then get a completely martensitic structure, right? So to do this, we need to make sure we have this gap here, right, between the perlite and bainite bay, right? So, right, and again, our same actors, niobium, vanadium, titanium, right? All right, clay, right? Remember the effect of these elements on the TTT diagram is to shift this off to the right, right? So to give us a better time window in which we can do this, right? And then we also get the fine dispersion of the carbides that form from these elements, right? So os forming, becomes a really important process for very demanding structural applications. There's a lot of other subtle things that go on because we have a variant selection in the martensite that happens. Right, this is another thing that happens in HTMT as well. Right, we've deformed. Right, so since we're nucleating at these grain boundaries, we can get variant selection. So we're not randomly selecting from the 24 variants. We get packets of martensite that have similar orientations, right, and that gives us some better toughness, right? So in this case, in os forming, the major contribution to the strength is from the fine dispersion of the alloy carbides, right? So much of what we talked about with aluminum is really also critical to steel, right? Is that we're coming up with different strategies to get these fine dispersions, right? Either through quench and tempering, through secondary hardening of alloy steels, or through controlled thermomechanical processes, right? We want a martensite structure with fine carbides that we can then temper to get back some of our toughness, right? And that, if that's sort of like wrapping up all this heat treatment stuff into one sort of coherent sentence statement, right? That's our goal, right? Fine dispersion of carbides, small grains, right? And then tempering to the amount that we're going to diffuse carbon out, right? And either change our structure from tetragonal back to cubic, depending on our use case.